Hello, welcome to this video for Comp 6259. That's Advanced Game Design at the University of Southampton. My name's Dave Millard, and in this video we're going to be talking about the game design pipeline. Many people will break that pipeline down into three different stages. The first stage is pre-production. So this is where we design the game itself. The next stage is production. That's where we go through the development process and actually build it. So at the end of that we have the game as an artifact. And the last is post-production. So that's where we want to establish the game, build an audience, and get it out there and support it in the world. Other people will take this process and describe it as 7 different stages, but roughly speaking they still break down into those 3. So pre-production here becomes both planning and pre-production. Production turns into not just production but also includes testing and kind of pre-launch activities, and then post-production will be the launch itself and then the post-launch process where you support it. Across those 3 stages, you'll have a huge number of people involved in all sorts of different roles. So very often, the whole thing will be kicked off by a creative director or operations director. This is someone who has overall control of the vision for the project. And they may be supported by a project manager or a producer. That's the person who's in charge of the day-to-day management of the team and actually getting the thing built. Then you have game designers, our systems designers. They're building the interactive systems, the mechanics, the game engine. You might have level designers and quest designers who are building the sub-compartments, the individual levels or activities that players are doing within the game. Then you have someone who has to bring all that together and kind of do the coding itself, so you have a game developer or programmer. And then you have a host of creative people on the team too, so you have artists and modelers, narrative designers and writers, actors and directors, audio engineers and sound designers, etc, etc. Finally, you have a very important group of people in the quality assurance team, so those are the ones we might call playtesters. They're the people who are making sure that all of the work that the other people in the team are doing has met the required standard, that there's no bugs, and providing feedback on things that might need to change. Now those different people can also exist at different levels of seniority. So for example, you might have a lead game designer, you might have senior game designers, and you might have junior game designers. And all of those are working together to try and produce the game. So as you can imagine, this can result in a huge number of people being involved. If you take a large AAA game, something like GTA 5 for example, that has more than 6,000 people who've worked on it over a period of more than a decade. Now even games that we think of as being kind of auteur games, the work of a single person, actually can have a very large team of people behind them. So Return of the Obra Dinn by Lucas Pope, actually that was a team of 69 people. As well as himself, Lucas also worked with musicians and modelers, and crucially a large team of people doing localization, enabling him to sell the game not only in English markets but also in markets that spoke French and German and Spanish and so forth. So let's move through the different stages of the pipeline. Well, we start off in pre-production. That's where we're going to design the game and decide what it is we're going to build. Now it's going to start with conceptualization and planning, ideation. Typically the operations director would get a group of people together. They would come up with a premise for the game. They might commission concept art for the game, and they might bring people in to provide some kind of business context. They're thinking about the potential market. They would also think about the scale of the game and what the budget would need to be. And the budget for these things can be absolutely vast. If you take a very small indie game, so that might be 2 people across 2 years, well, if you're paying each of those people, say £40,000, which is a very modest salary for the sort of talents and skills that you need, well, that's going to cost you £160,000 to produce that game. But only the top 5% of games make more than £400,000, and actually the average for games is more like £10,000. So really, even at the small indie level, if you want to actually make money, then you're going to have to be a sort of a 1 in 10 hit. At the AAA level, the numbers can be absolutely astonishing. So we talked about GTA 5 a moment ago, but a typical AAA game might have, say, 1,000 people working on it. Well, 1,000 people over maybe a 4-year development cycle, that would be £200 million, right? But the returns can be vast. So GTA 5, over the decade since it's been released, has made $8 billion. That's more than the top 2 movies, Avatar and Avengers Endgame, put together. So it's a very significant amount of money, very significant investment. And that's before you add in the marketing costs, which can be up to 100% of your development costs. So when you're thinking about a game, never underestimate the importance or the potential expense of marketing. Once you know what you're going to build and you have your budget in place, you need to actually come up with a design to turn that conceptualization into something concrete that you can produce. Now, we have 5 decades of experience of how to build software, and games are software. So you might think that we could bring in some of the traditional techniques from software engineering, things like functional and non-functional requirements, UML like use cases, activity and sequence diagrams, perhaps wireframes. But do these really work for games? Do they capture the essence of what a game is? Well, the games industry has found in general that they don't. So instead what they do is they turn to the idea of a game design document. So that's a kind of a single document that captures in both text and also in images the kind of the essence of the game, as well as kind of going through some of its elements. So why would you want to put together a game design document? Well, the 2 main reasons are that it produces a kind of a common understanding amongst everyone in the team, and even small games can have a large team. But also, and as perhaps importantly as well, is it forces you to start thinking of a complete vision. It explores all of the kind of the dark corners of the game, makes you think about how all of those kinds of systems interact, and makes you do that on paper before you actually try and do it in any kind of production system. Now, unfortunately, there are no definitive templates for what a game design document should look like. But that's for a very good reason, because every game is different, and therefore the things that you need in that document in order to describe those games is going to be different. It also might vary according to the audience, who is it intended for. So early in the pre-production phase, you might be trying to get the finances together. So you want more of a kind of a pitch game design document. So this would include lots of the commercial considerations. Who is the audience? What's the platform going to be? What's your monetization mechanism going to be? You also might want to capture here the kind of unique selling points, the things that will make your game stand out, both in terms of the experience and perhaps the technology that you're using, as well as also reflecting on the competition, previous games you've built on, and any kind of market analysis that you have access to. The games design documents that we typically talk about on this course are play-focused game design documents. So these would try and capture more of the elements of play around the game. So, what are the goals that the player is trying to achieve? What's the core gameplay loop and the controls? And then, the MDA framework. What are the dynamics that are involved? What are the specific mechanics? And also you might start enumerating things like who are the enemies? What do they look like? What's their behavior going to be? What sort of weapons or items might you pick up? What are some of the level designs or worlds that you might have? And for all of those things, actually including illustrations, conceptual art, that's all going to be really helpful to kind of capture the flavour of what you're trying to get to. You'll also have kind of descriptions of the kind of the audio of the game and other kind of elements of the aesthetic. In narrative games, you might change the emphasis. So some of the things are the same. You still want to talk about the dynamics and mechanics, for example, the UI. But now you want to try and foreground things like the premise. You might want to talk more about the game world and the background, the characters involved and the lore, as well, of course, as the story structure and the sort of dramatic arc that's involved. Another thing that's really useful to include in your game design document are your game design pillars. These are 3 to 5 key elements that really get across the unique flavour of your game. Now, game design pillars can kind of improve coherence, meaning everything in your game is aligned, but it also improves communication. Everyone's on the same page. It's a great way to sanity check new ideas. So someone suggests something and you can ask, does it fit with our pillars? Does it actually enhance what we're trying to do, or does it distract from the kind of main message of our game? So it's a little bit in that regard like the core dynamics that we discussed in Comp 3218, the games design course, saying, does everything in your game all funnel together and pull in the same direction to create a kind of a common vision? So you can go online and you can see the game design pillars that were used for various different games. For example, in The Last of Us, there were 4 game design pillars. The first was crafting, the idea being that resources in the landscape were scarce and the player would be required to both find them and then bring them together and craft them into more useful items. That the game was all about story, so they were unashamedly a linear story, which was very narrative-led, so everything had to contribute to that story. That the game was all about building a relationship with your AI partners, and in particular the relationship between Ellie and Joel, and also that the game was about stealth, that while combat appeared, this was never going to be a first-person shooter, that you were always going to be trying to think about how you could make your way stealthily through these environments, and there would be an element of survival to the game. When a new element was being added to the game, so for example a new level or a new area of the world, the game design team could ask themselves, does this contribute to the story? Does it progress the story? Does it provide opportunities to build that relationship between the player and the non-player characters? And does it draw on those kind of key mechanics of crafting and of stealth? Okay, so you've designed your game, you know what you're going to build, you know what your key ideas are. Now you have to actually go into production and you have to build it. So the production phase goes through 7 different stages. The first of which, prototyping, or the minimum viable product, arguably belongs in the pre-production stage, but we'll include it here. So all the way through this, we're going to be demonstrating on the right-hand side here how much of the game is built. So here the vertical axis represents the number of mechanics, kind of the different systems that are built in the game, and the horizontal axis represents the progress. So that's, you know, how far through the game we've got, how many levels have we designed of the game. So the first thing is your minimum viable product. So this is going to be a relatively small proportion of the game. It doesn't necessarily even have to be the beginning of the game. It could be a little way in, and it's certainly not all of the mechanics. What you're trying to do with a minimum viable product is create something which is a way of exploring your key idea and key mechanics and finding out if they're any good. So let's say, for example, that you've decided that you want to build a game with a grappling gun mechanic where you can swing about and move from platform to platform. Well, that's what you build here. You build a little level, you create a character you can control, you create the grappling gun mechanic, and off you go. And you try and explore whether or not that's fun or not. There's a saying here which is to fail fast and follow the fun. So very often the prototyping and the game design document will actually be in a kind of a series of tight iterations as you try different things, find out what works and what doesn't work, and revise what you're doing. So in my grappling gun example, maybe you find out that actually if you have too much dependency on that gun, it ends up feeling a bit like Spider-Man, just swinging chaotically around the level. And so you want to use it a bit more strategically, and you might go back to your game design document, and your game might change from something that is a bit more action-based, perhaps to something that's a bit more puzzle-based. Once you have a kind of a key idea that you're happy with, that's working in prototyping, you would move forward to your first playable. So this is a sizable chunk of the game where you've got a significant amount of the mechanics created and a significant amount of the content in place. And here we're using kind of dark red to indicate stuff that's been completed and orange to indicate stuff which is still in draft. So you might have placeholder graphics and audio or text, for example. The first playable really gives you a chance to start to see the game come together, and it will help you move on to the next step, which is the vertical slice. So the vertical slice is a proportion of the game, but for that proportion, all of the mechanics are in place and they're all working. So this means you get a way of really understanding what the game is going to be like at the end, even if you're envisaging a 10-hour game, but you only have 20 minutes of playable content. From the vertical slice, you then move on to a kind of a pre-alpha. So this is where you build out the game, you start putting the majority of the mechanics in place. You've still got placeholder stuff in here, but you've got content spread throughout the game. You're very much, getting along through the development cycle. And the pre-alpha stage is essentially where you make a decision about where you're going to draw the line for your game. So you have it in envisaged games, represented by this dotted line, and your pre-alpha doesn't quite include that. But based on that experience, you can start to make some decisions. You might say that some of the things that you've actually included are actually detracting from the game and you should be removed. On the other hand, some of the things that you plan to include, well, maybe they're not needed anymore. Maybe you can't include them. You might have 6 months left to go, and you've got 8 months worth of activity. So you have to lose 25% of what you had planned. So what you do is you revise your plan based on the pre-alpha, and therefore you get a very definitive idea of what you need to build in order to get to the next stage, the alpha. So in the alpha stage, you have the whole game in draft. All of the mechanics are in place, all of the structures in place, all of the levels and content are in place. Some of that might still be placeholder, but you get a kind of a complete version of the envisaged game. And then finally you move to beta. So beta is where everything is in place, just like the alpha, but now you've got rid of all that placeholder stuff. Everything is essentially in place. It's like a first draft of the a first complete draft of the finished game. Now, betas can be closed, meaning that they're only playable by people within the team, or they could be open, so you could be inviting other people to come in and try this out, which actually gives us a good chance to talk about early access. So in fact, typically early access would be applied at the beta stage. So you have an early version of the game, you would release that to people who are really interested, and they would get early access to the game and be able to effectively be like an extended QA team. More recently though, we've seen games start to think about releasing as early as the vertical slice. So Larian produced Baldur's Gate. They released the entire Act 1 2 years before the final gold release of the game. And that's a very brave thing to do, but it clearly worked for Larian, and Baldur's Gate went through a number of iterations as people helped refine those systems, and then went on to be very successful. And just to finish this off, I've already mentioned it, but after the beta you go to the gold release. So the gold release is the final version of your game, the game where you think the majority of the bugs, certainly all of the game-breaking bugs have been dealt with. This is what you feel that you're comfortable to release to the public. So at the end of production, you have your game, you have your asset that you now want to capitalize on. So we enter the post-production stage where you want to establish it, build an audience. So we can think about the first part of post-production being about marketing and promotion. Arguably, this would have started earlier in the production stage. You're producing trailers, you're attending events, trying to build excitement for the game. You're commissioning advertisements, you're building a social media campaign. And those are all things that you might be able to do with earlier stages of development, perhaps with the vertical slice, for example. But ultimately you get to the launch, where you want to deploy your game, take it out into one of the stores, for example, and they all have different expenses. Steam has a one-time fee and then takes 30% of your sales. Something like Itch, which is perhaps a better platform for smaller indie releases, is free to use, but they will take 10% of sales. And then once it's launched, well, you still need to support your game. You still need to fix bugs. You might have content updates. They're a really good thing you can tie to marketing, for example, new levels, new characters, create a buzz for your game or continue the buzz for your game over time. And ultimately you can try and make additional money by releasing downloadable content, DLC. Post-production is also where you reflect on the game and the game development process. What went right, what went wrong, what lessons have you learned for future projects? And here you might consider both the process of creation, so how you worked as a team, how you managed assets within the team, how you communicated, and you might think about gameplay and game design decisions that you've made and what worked and what didn't work, what you might do differently next time. And finally, you'd create a closing kit. So this is essentially a formal archive of all of the elements of the project, from the original design documents and all of their different versions, through to the assets and the content that was created by the team, to the code itself. So your closing kit is obviously useful as a general future reference if you're working on a different game and you want to reflect back on what you've done. But it's absolutely essential if you want to create downloadable content for your game, if you want to develop sequels from your game. Basically means you're not starting from scratch. And that takes us to the end of the pipeline. We've been through the pre-production stage where we've done sort of ideation, we've put market research, we've put budgets together, we've developed that all-important game design document and identified what our pillars are going to be. We've been through the production process, running right the way from our prototyping and minimum viable product in order to find the fun, through our kind of first playable, our vertical slice, and then ultimately through to a beta that we might have out as early access, and then into a gold release. And then the post-production stage where we support our game and build our audience and try to maximize the commercial benefit we get from it. So that's where we start thinking about marketing, we think about kind of the platforms that we're going to launch on, and we also talk about reflection. What have we learned from this process? What can we take forward to future projects? Well, that's it for this video on the game design pipeline. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again in the next video.